Greetings. Today we're going to have a tutorial on how deflation is in fact a much worse thing than moderate inflation or even slightly high inflation, and only when inflation becomes extremely high, known as hyperinflation, is there actually a problem with inflation, and we are nowhere close to anything that could be remotely called hyperinflation in the economy today. And so this viewpoint is contrarian to the prevailing narrative out there. And the mainstream is being misled and miseducated, sometimes by people who don't know what they're talking about, or sometimes by people who do know what they're talking about but are trying to perpetuate a narrative for a pump and dump scheme. But either way, we're going to learn about the impact of deflation versus inflation on the average person's finances. So we first start with this table over here, which represents two types of economies, neither of which is ideal, but still one is worse than the other. Consider an inflationary economy, like the one we have right now, where there is inflation that's a little bit higher than desired, but very temporary, of course. And let's say people's income was rising only 4%, while the inflation rate were 6% on an ongoing basis. So their income is increasing less than the inflation rate. That is inconvenient, of course, because prices are rising faster than your income is rising, and for people with very little discretionary income, the poorest people, they have to give up a lot of basic necessities in some cases. But they're lagging by about 2% a year. That is inconvenient, that is problematic for people at the very bottom of the ladder, but that's not the end of the world. I still term this as a nuisance. Now consider by contrast a deflationary economy. Now as critical as I am of the Federal Reserve and PhD economists, they're only the second worst people out there on the topic of inflation, because the Federal Reserve does in fact realize how bad deflation would be. That's why they keep doing QE when inflation gets too low. If they had the oversimplified view that inflation is always bad and deflation is actually good, then they wouldn't do QE and we would have deflation. Thankfully, at least the PhD economists of the Federal Reserve know that deflation is bad because the Great Depression had a lot of deflation. It was long enough ago that it's in economics textbooks. But a lot of average people have a super simplified understanding of this whole topic, and they assume all inflation is bad and all deflation is good because they cannot think beyond the concept of inflation means I'm paying more for things, deflation means I'm paying less for things. And they don't see how that might connect to their own income and the general sentiment in society, including the sentiment that their employer holds. So take this situation, the deflationary economy. Yes, prices are dropping by 2%. Sounds great, doesn't it? Well, what if your job is gone? What if the unemployment rate is so high that a major fraction of the economy, 25-30% of people, are unemployed and your income has gone down 100%? I think after I explain it this way, most people would rather choose this upper economy as the lesser evil than this lower economy, because that is a far worse situation, and it can last for a long time. That's why the Great Depression lasted for 10 years, because it was deflationary and they didn't have a technological solution like we have today. Now, lest you say that not everyone loses their job, only a few people lose their job, well, let's go to this other slide over here then. Let's say it only goes down 50% because demand for products and services goes down so much that some people lose their job entirely, but some people don't lose their job. Some people are reduced to part-time and so forth. That's still terrible. Would you rather have your income increasing by 4% and inflation rising 6%, or prices dropping by 2% a year, which sounds good until you realize your income dropped a lot faster? And this is in fact what does happen. You don't have a robust job market when you also have deflation, because we are a debt-heavy economy and we are an economy where capital seeks return on leverage. So let me give you an example of housing and how it behaves in an inflationary or deflationary environment. So take this chart. The horizontal axis represents years 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so forth. And the vertical axis represents the monthly income or expenditures of people. So let's say you have a home on a mortgage that is $2,000 a month, and the payment stays flat because it's a fixed rate mortgage. The blue line is scenario number 1, where the person's annual income is rising 5% a year, and therefore they make $6,000 a month the first year, the second is $6,300 a month, and so forth, 5% a year rising. As you can see, the mortgage payment continues to become less relative to the person's income. The mortgage payment continues to go down. And this is how a mortgage is supposed to work, and this is how people build home equity, because their payment stays the same, but the price of the home rises so that equity goes up and the mortgage shrinks as a portion of their income. And for all the horror stories about inflation in the 1970s, since a mortgaged home is really just a leveraged bet on local inflation, and that's what makes home prices go up. People who owned homes at the start of the 1970s made a ton of money by the end of the 1970s. For example, if you owned a mortgaged home in 1970, by 1982, you were quite well off. You had tons of home equity and your mortgage payment has shrunk to nothing. So inflation was actually the easiest money-making mechanism in those days because of the relatively high inflation and the very dramatic shrinkage effect it had on mortgage payments. Now, scenario number two, which the United States has not experienced at any time in the lifetimes of anyone alive today to a significant degree, is deflation. So let's say you bought the same home and the mortgage payment was $2,000 a month, again, the orange line, and the income of $6,000 a month is decreasing by 1% a year, this gray line. As you can see, the mortgage payment stays the same, but the dollars of income are becoming less and less. Therefore, the mortgage payment is increasing as a portion of the person's income. That is an extremely stressful situation to be in, and that's why deflation is far more catastrophic to anyone with debt, and especially to a society where everyone has debt, like the United States. The United States is a debt-heavy society, and therefore deflation is far, far, far more destructive than inflation, including moderately high inflation like 3% or 4% a year. Deflation is what anyone with debt should be afraid of. That's why it's so ridiculous that in the United States, the perception of high inflation is based on just really two things: the price of milk at the grocery store and the price of gasoline at the gas station. And no one seems to grasp that if they have a home on mortgage, inflation is their friend and deflation is the biggest nightmare they can imagine. They should be extremely glad that there is even some inflation, because whatever small amount of inflation exists today, 2% a year is what the average has been over the last 10 years, despite all the quantitative easing by the Federal Reserve. 2% a year is what is preventing them from disaster that would occur if deflation were to creep upon them and they have a fixed mortgage payment. So this is a very simple chart that explains how anyone with a mortgage or similar such fixed debt benefits tremendously from inflation and suffers tremendously under deflation. We're assuming, of course, that people's incomes rise with inflation. Some people's incomes rise above inflation, some people's incomes rise less than inflation, but on average their incomes do exceed inflation because there is economic growth and nominal GDP contains an inflation component. Now, the economics profession has actually misrepresented this fact to the public and comes up with a lot of very misguided and inaccurate concepts to confuse average people further, and that's why so many people, including very well-educated people, are extremely uninformed about the realities of inflation and deflation. And there are concepts like the misery index which perpetuate this misconception and spread ignorance even further.